The academy grounds stretched wide under the pale morning sun, its iron gates glinting as though they guarded a world apart from ordinary life. Within those gates stood rows of gray stone buildings, polished brass plaques, and immaculate lawns that gave no hint of the storms, both natural and human, that cadets endured within. For her, stepping into this world had felt like crossing a threshold she might never return from. She was only one cadet among hundreds, a small figure swallowed in the rhythm of drills, uniforms, and tradition. Her mornings began before dawn. The bells clanged at 5 o'clock sharp, echoing through the dormitory like an unyielding summons. She would leap from her narrow bunk, her feet hitting the cold floor, scrambling to dress before the inspection siren sounded. Every fold of her uniform had to be crisp, every boot polished to a shine that reflected the ceiling lights. The smallest mistake meant punishment, extra drills, laps across the field, or hours scrubbing floors until her hands burned raw. Discipline was the language of the academy, and mistakes were never tolerated. Though her body obeyed, her spirit often wrestled with doubt. She watched her peers, sons and daughters of decorated officers, move with confidence that seemed untouchable. They carried the weight of legacy in their blood, their names whispered with respect. She, on the other hand, had no lineage to boast of, no father's shadow to step into. Her family came from quiet towns, farmers and workers who knew little of the sea. She was an outsider in every sense, her acceptance into the academy earned through relentless effort and a determination she barely dared admit out loud. In the training yard, instructors barked orders like thunderclaps. Left face, forward march, hold the line. The cadets moved in perfect unison, boots striking the ground like one body, one voice. Yet even here, she felt the weight of invisibility. Her steps were precise, but unnoticed. Her salutes were sharp, but overlooked. In the grand machine of the academy, she was another cog, replaceable, unremarkable. At night, when drills and studies ended, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the ventilation system filling the silence. She wondered if greatness was truly meant for her. Could someone like her ever rise to stand among legends? Or would she always remain one of the nameless many who marched, trained, and vanished without leaving a mark? Her inner conflict sharpened during classroom sessions. In naval strategy lectures, she absorbed maps, tactics, and case studies with a hunger that set her apart. While others yawned or whispered about weekend leave, she leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously, tracing the moves of famous battles with her finger along the maps. She loved the complexity of command, the balance of precision and instinct, the art of reading chaos like a hidden language. Yet her eagerness often drew sneers. "Calm down, cadet," one of her peers would mock. "You're not going to be an admiral overnight." Their laughter stung more than she admitted. In those moments, she realized the battlefield she faced was not just drills or exams, it was the silent war of belonging. Still, she refused to bend. When punishment details came, she accepted them without complaint. When endurance tests pushed cadets to collapse, she clenched her teeth and pushed further, willing her body to obey even when her legs screamed. She knew she was not the strongest, nor the loudest, but she carried something else, stubborn resolve. Her determination found quiet strength in small victories. During navigation practice, she plotted courses faster than most of her class. In marksmanship, though her hands trembled at first, she steadied them through hours of repetition, her shots tightening into perfect clusters. In survival training, while others groaned in the mud, she adapted quickly, using resourcefulness. That came from her modest upbringing. These achievements did not bring applause, but they built a foundation, brick by brick, that she alone could feel beneath her feet, yet invisibility lingered. During assemblies, she stood in rows as medals were awarded, names called, honors bestowed. She clapped with the others, her heart aching quietly. The thought came often, will anyone ever notice me? The academy had a way of testing more than skills. It tested patience, identity, and belief. She often thought of quitting, imagining herself walking through the iron gates for the last time, free of inspections and punishments. But every time, something pulled her back. It was not pride or obligation. It was the faint, stubborn belief that she was meant for something more. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the training yard glowed in shades of gold and crimson, she lingered after drills. The field was empty, but she stood still, watching the flag ripple against the wind. She whispered to herself words she dared not say aloud. One day, I'll be more than this. One day, I'll prove them wrong. Her story was still invisible to those around her, but within her burned an ember. She did not yet know that fate was listening, that soon the trials of the academy would place her in situations where instinct mattered more than heritage, where courage would outweigh tradition. She did not yet know that an admiral's eyes would one day find her in the crowd, calling forth the iron wolf within. For now, she was only a cadet marching, studying, doubting, and dreaming. But every dawn, every drill, every quiet moment of endurance was shaping her into something no one, not even she, could yet imagine. And while the others saw nothing remarkable, she carried the quiet resilience of those who wait, watch, and endure. History has always been written by those overlooked, until the moment arrives when the world has no choice but to see them. Her moment had not yet come, but it was approaching, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The academy was not just a place of training, it was a shrine to history. Every hallway carried echoes of those who had come before, and every cadet walking its stone floors felt the weight of invisible eyes watching from portraits hung high on the walls. Admirals, captains, and decorated heroes looked down with stern faces, their uniforms immaculate, their medals gleaming even through layers of varnish. To walk beneath them was to be reminded constantly. Greatness was not invented here, it was inherited, guarded, and passed down like a sacred heirloom. For many cadets, this legacy was a source of pride. They walked taller, knowing their fathers and grandfathers had stood where they stood, fought where they would one day fight, commanded. Ships whose names were written in textbooks. Their confidence came naturally. Their worth had been proven before they even marched through the academy's gates. They bore family names that instructors recognized instantly, names that carried respect like a second rank. For her, the tradition pressed differently. Her family tree held no admirals, no commanders, not even a sailor who had worn a uniform with stripes. She was the daughter of quiet people, her father a machinist in a factory, her mother a teacher in a small-town school. They had given her values of hard work, humility, and persistence, but none of these carried prestige here. To the academy's unspoken code, she was a blank page. The whispers followed her. Who is she? Cadets muttered in the mess hall. No one important, just another filler seat. The words stung, though she never let her face betray it. She kept her chin high, her movements sharp, her focus locked, even when every glance reminded her she was an outsider. Tradition bled into every aspect of life at the academy. Cadets saluted not just to superiors, but to the very spirit of the FIA institution, a spirit built on centuries of battles fought at sea, victories carved through sacrifice. They memorized oaths, rituals, and codes that bound them into something larger than themselves. For some, it was natural. For her, it was an act of will, each recitation a vow to carve her own place where none had been offered. One evening, during a lecture in the great hall, she sat quietly at her desk, pen poised, while the instructor paced before them. His voice thundered as he spoke of the Battle of Midway, of how the United States Navy had turned the tide of war, not through luck, but through bravery and tradition. "It is tradition," he declared, "that shapes leaders. We are forged by the examples of those who came before us. Without tradition, there is no foundation, no discipline, no navy." The hall echoed with nods and murmurs of agreement, but she felt her chest tighten. Was tradition truly the only forge? Did a person without a legacy have no right to leadership? The thought gnawed at her as she scribbled notes furiously, capturing every word, not because she believed it, but because she was determined to challenge it. Later, in the dormitories, the cadets gathered in clusters, their conversations loud, with jokes and banter. She lingered at the edge, silent, listening. "My grandfather captained the Resolute," one cadet boasted. "My father commanded in the Gulf." Laughter and admiration followed. Another cadet pulled a silver medallion from his drawer. A family heirloom passed through 3 generations of service. Pride shone in his eyes as he displayed it like proof of destiny. She turned away, climbing onto her bunk with quiet grace. In her locker lay nothing but folded uniforms and worn notebooks. No medals, no heirlooms, no family stories of battle. Only her. And yet, when the lights dimmed and silence settled, she found herself whispering into the darkness. Perhaps tradition is not only inherited, perhaps tradition can be built. The academy tested this belief at every term. During inspections, instructors compared cadets harshly, praising those who carried themselves with practiced pride while scrutinizing her with cold eyes. "You lack presence," one officer told her bluntly. Leadership requires more than following orders. It requires bloodline. "You must prove you deserve to stand here." The words lodged deep like barbed wire, tearing whenever she moved, but she refused to bend. She threw herself into studies with a hunger that startled even her professors. Naval history, tactical theory, maritime law, she consumed it all, filling her notebooks with pages upon pages of scribbled notes. Where others relied on inherited confidence, she relied on preparation. If tradition would not give her power, then knowledge would. In the training fields, she found ways to push beyond expectation, while others mocked the grueling endurance. Runs, she treated them as battles to conquer. Sweat drenched her uniform, muscles screamed, but she never slowed. "You're stubborn," one instructor muttered grudgingly after she finished a punishing course. It was not praise, but it was acknowledgement, and it mattered more to her than applause. Her greatest solace came in the academy library. Among rows of dusty tomes and records, she traced the lives of those once unknown who had risen to greatness. She discovered names buried in history books, ordinary sailors who, through courage, had become legends. Their stories whispered to her, urging her onward. They had not all been born into tradition. Some, like her, had carved their place through fire. One rainy night, as she sat by the window reading, lightning flashing across the dark sea, she pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "If they could, then so can I." The weight of tradition did not disappear. It pressed down daily, in ceremonies, in rituals, in the very air she breathed. But instead of crushing her, it began to shape her resolve. She realized tradition was not a chain, but a test. It asked, "Are you strong enough to stand among giants, even when no one believes you belong?" Her answer, though unspoken, was clear. She would stand. She would endure. She would wait until the day came when tradition itself would have no choice but to recognize her. For now, she walked through the academy's halls with her head high, her footsteps echoing against the stone like a quiet promise. She was still, invisible to most, still dismissed as an outsider, but within her, a silent vow grew stronger each day. She would not inherit greatness. She would build it. And when the time came, she would prove that tradition was not only preserved by those Born into it, it was reborn in those brave enough to claim it. The day began like any other gray skies stretching above the academy, the sea churning restlessly beyond the cliffs, and the cadets moving in formation across the yard. She had woken before dawn, as always, her uniform pressed, her boots polished, to a mirror finish. Nothing in the morning drills suggested that this day would carve itself into memory. To her, it was just another day of training, another day to remain invisible among louder voices. But fate rarely announces itself in advance. The Academy's schedule for that afternoon was the storm. Simulation, a carefully designed test meant to mimic the chaos of a real crisis at sea. For cadets, it was both dreaded and revered. The instructors boasted that the simulation had humbled even the strongest, breaking those who thought themselves untouchable. Some cadets had dropped out after failing it, their dreams ending in the control rooms flashing lights and alarms. It was the Academy's way of separating instinct from illusion. As she entered the simulation chamber, her heart thudded against her ribs. The room was a replica of a ship's command deck walls, lined with screens, consoles, and flashing indicators. The overhead lights flickered, casting an ominous glow. Rows of cadets took their positions under the sharp eyes of instructors, who monitored every movement. "Remember," the lead officer barked, "in chaos, discipline decides survival. Act without thought, and you will fail. Act with hesitation, and you will fail. Only instinct and clarity will save your ship." The cadets exchanged nervous glances, some laughing to mask their fear. She stood silently at her console, fingers hovering over the controls. The simulation began quietly, a distant rumble of thunder on the speakers, the faint rocking of the floor beneath their feet. Then, like a predator pouncing, the storm struck. Sirens blared. Warning lights flashed red across every panel. Screens showed towering waves crashing against the ship, lightning splitting the sky. The deck tilted violently, sending cadets stumbling. Alarms screamed of system failures, navigation offline, communications cut, engine damage escalating. "Stabilize course," one cadet shouted. "No, secure the engines first." Another barked. Orders clashed, voices overlapped, and panic thickened the air. The instructors remained silent, their faces unreadable as they watched the chaos unfold. Her pulse raced. She gripped the console, forcing her breath steady. Around her, cadets shouted over one another, fumbling with switches, misreading data, colliding like headless bodies. The simulated ship pitched harder, and an alarm warned of imminent capsize. No one was in control. And then, without thinking, she stepped forward. "Engine room first," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the noise. "Stabilize power. Then steer into the waves. We'll lose everything if the engines fail." Some cadets hesitated, glaring. "Who put you in charge?" One sneered, but she didn't flinch. "Do it now." She barked, louder this time, her voice steadier than she felt inside. Her fingers flew across the panel, rerouting power to critical. "Systems. Helm, adjust heading 30 degrees starboard, into the wave. Don't fight it, ride it." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, instinctively, they obeyed. Hands slammed switches, data feeds flickered, and the simulated engines roared back online. The deck steadied slightly, enough to catch a collective breath. She pressed on, commanding without hesitation. "Navigation plot emergency course. To calmer waters. Damage control seal the flooding compartments. Keep communications offline until power stabilizes. Focus on survival first." The cadets moved in a rhythm now, following her directions as if they had trained under her for months. The ship steadied further, alarms fading one by one. Screens showed the vessel, piercing through the storm rather than being consumed by it. Minutes later, The simulation ended abruptly. The alarm ceased, the lights returned to normal, and the deck stopped rocking. Silence swallowed the room. The cadets turned, wide-eyed, toward the instructors at the back. For once, they're stoic. Expressions had shifted into something else, approval, though faint. But before they could speak, the room erupted. "That was luck," one cadet muttered bitterly. "She guessed," another snapped. Anyone could have done that. Their jealousy was sharp, their pride wounded by her unexpected command. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, her throat dry. Had it truly been luck? No, she knew it wasn't. She had felt it: instinct, clarity in the storm, a calmness she had never known she possessed. For a brief moment, she had not been invisible. She had led. The instructors gave no recognition, no medals, no speeches. The simulation was over, and the cadets were dismissed. But as she walked out, she carried something far greater than applause. Proof to herself that she could stand in chaos and not shatter. That night, lying on her bunk, she replayed the storm in her mind. She remembered the panic in her peers' eyes, the crack of her own voice, the sudden silence when they listened. She remembered the surge of certainty that had flowed through her veins. For the first time since entering the academy, she believed she was not just a shadow among legacies. She was something more. The other cadets mocked her still, dismissing her actions as chance, but she no longer cared. She had faced the storm and found strength she hadn't known was hers. The academy had thrown its first true test at her, and though the records would not mark her name, she knew. Deep down, something within her had awakened. It was not tradition, not lineage, not legacy. It was instinct. It was the spark of leadership. And though the world did not yet see it, though the portraits of admirals still looked down with cold eyes, she whispered into the darkness of the dormitory, "One day they will know. One day I will not be invisible." For the storm had revealed something no one could erase, the first glimpse of the iron wolf that lay waiting inside her. The storm simulation had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the alarms faded. In the weeks that followed, whispers trailed her across the academy halls. Some cadets still dismissed her actions as luck, clinging to their pride. Others regarded her differently, now wary, curious, even resentful. She had shown something unexpected, something that broke the unspoken order of hierarchy. And though no official recognition had come, she felt the shift in the air around her. But she was not the only one who had noticed. From the observation deck above the simulation chamber, the Admiral had watched. He rarely attended training sessions. His duties stretched across fleets, operations, and international negotiations. Yet that day, almost by chance, he had stepped into the shadowed gallery, his sharp eyes studying the cadets below. The storm simulation was designed to test not only skill but instinct, and he knew well how it exposed a person's truest nature. He had seen many cadets falter, their bravado collapsing under pressure. He had seen heirs of powerful legacies crumble, their names worth nothing in the face of chaos. But in her, an anonymous cadet, small and almost overlooked, he had seen something different. She had stood in the middle of panic, her voice cutting through fear like steel through fog. She had not hesitated. She had not shouted for recognition. She had simply acted. It was instinct, raw and unpolished, but unmistakable. For days after, her image lingered in his mind, the cadet whose presence demanded no attention, yet commanded in silence when it mattered most. He wanted to see if it had been a fleeting moment, or the seed of something greater. The opportunity came soon enough. One morning, as the cadets filed into the yard for inspection, she stood among them, boots aligned, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward. The air smelled of salt from the nearby sea, and the sun cast long shadows across the rows. The instructors moved briskly, checking uniforms, correcting postures. Then, unexpectedly, the Admiral himself strode onto the grounds. The yard fell silent. His very presence commanded it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his white uniform immaculate, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of decades at sea. His hair was streaked with gray, his jaw set in firm resolve. But it was his eyes that silenced even the boldest. Cadet eyes that carried storms, victories, and the weight of countless decisions made under fire. The Admiral's boots clicked against the stone as he moved along the rows, inspecting cadets with a glance that seemed to strip away every layer of pretense. Most cadets straightened, their nerves trembling beneath their rigid postures. Some dared to hope for a nod of approval. When he stopped in front of her, she felt her breath catch. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze swept over her uniform flawless, though ordinary before, lifting to her face. She kept her eyes forward, her jaw locked, every nerve in her, body screaming with the effort not to falter. Then, with a voice deep as the ocean, he spoke. "You." The single word cracked through the silence. A dozen heads turned toward her. "Yes, Admiral," she answered, her voice steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. He studied her a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I watched the storm." Her eyes flickered for the first time, surprise breaking through discipline. "Sir, you acted when others froze," he said simply. "That is instinct. Instinct cannot be taught." The words struck her harder than any command. In her months at the academy, she had heard only criticism, dismissal, and doubt. To hear acknowledgement from him, the Admiral himself, was almost too heavy to bear. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain still, but he was not finished. "Do not waste it," he said, his tone sharp, deliberate. "Instinct is nothing without discipline, and discipline without courage is worthless. Remember this." Then, as suddenly as he had stopped, he moved on, his boots carrying him down the line, his attention shifting to others. The yard buzzed with unspoken energy. Cadets exchanged quick glances, whispers forming at the edges of their lips. She stood, frozen, her heart pounding, his words echoing in her skull. "I watched the storm. Instinct cannot be taught." For the rest of the inspection, she moved in a daze. She answered commands, marched with precision, but her mind replayed his voice again and again. It was not praise, not truly. It was warning, guidance, challenge. And yet, it was more recognition than she had ever received in her life. That evening, she sat alone in the library, the Admiral's words burning in her chest. "Do not waste it." She traced the spines of books with her fingertips, each title a reminder of the tradition she fought against. She realized then that the Admiral had seen her not as invisible, not as unworthy, but as something unfinished. The realization shook her. It was not validation she had been given. It was responsibility. The following days brought more subtle encounters. Once, during drills, she caught sight of him observing from a distance, his arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. Another time, in the mess hall, she felt his eyes on her as he passed, speaking quietly to an instructor. He never approached her again directly, but she sensed his presence like a storm lingering just beyond the horizon. Her peers noticed too. Whispers grew louder, tinged with envy. Why her? Some muttered, "She's no one. She has no family." Name. Others shrugged it off, claiming the Admiral's interest would fade, but she ignored them. The Admiral's words had carved too deeply into her heart. Late at night, lying awake, she thought of him. Not as a hero on the wall, not as a distant figure of tradition, but as a man who had chosen to see her when no one else had. His challenge had lit a fire in her. For the first time, She no longer dreamed of proving herself to her peers. She dreamed of proving herself worthy of the Admiral's trust. It was a dangerous dream, because to be seen was to be tested, and she knew now that her days of invisibility were over. The Admiral had noticed her, and when an Admiral noticed, the sea itself seemed to shift. The days after inspection felt different. She walked the same halls, marched across the same fields, studied beneath the same portraits, but something had shifted within her. The Admiral's words replayed endlessly in her mind. I watched the storm. Instinct cannot be taught. Do not waste it. Those words had been few, but they carried the weight of oceans. They pressed against her with equal measures of pride and fear. She was no longer unseen. Someone had noticed, he had noticed, and that meant her actions mattered now in ways they never had before. Still, uncertainty gnawed at her. Recognition was one thing. Living up to it was another. It was 3 mornings later when she was summoned. The order came abruptly during drills. Cadet, report to the Admiral's office. Every head turned as she stepped out of formation. Whispers followed her like shadows. No cadet was ever called to the Admiral's office unless they were in deep trouble or chosen for something extraordinary. Her boots echoed down the long marble corridor that led to his chambers. The walls here were lined not with training posters or tactical maps, but with history itself. Flags carried into battle, medals from long-forgotten wars, the framed photographs of ships that had shaped the Navy's legacy. Each artifact seemed to remind her she did not belong. At the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door loomed, polished to a gleam. She raised her hand, knocked once, and heard his commanding voice from within. Enter. The office was vast, its tall windows overlooking the restless sea. A massive desk sat at its center, papers neatly arranged, a single brass compass resting. On one corner, behind it stood the Admiral, his presence as commanding as ever, though his eyes softened slightly when they found her. Cadet, he said. His tone was neither warm nor cold, but it held attention like gravity. She saluted sharply. Sir. For a long moment, he simply studied her, as though weighing every unspoken word. Then he motioned to the chair opposite. His desk. Sit. She obeyed, her spine stiff, her palms damp against her knees. You are not like the others, he began. You don't carry a name that echoes through these halls. You don't rely on lineage or inherited confidence. And yet, in the storm, you acted. His voice deepened. That is not common. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to answer. I only did what I thought was right, sir. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing with intensity. And that, he said, is exactly why it matters. Others wait for orders. You gave them. Her pulse thundered. She wanted to argue, to insist she wasn't ready, but the Admiral's gaze left no room for protest. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn notebook. On its cover, embossed in faded gold, were 2 words. Call signs. Her breath caught. Call signs were not handed out lightly. They were earned, carried like banners into every mission, symbols of identity stronger than rank or uniform. The Admiral opened the notebook, turned a page, and looked at her again. From today, he said firmly, you are Iron Wolf. The word struck her like a cannon blast. Iron Wolf. She repeated softly, almost disbelieving. Yes, he confirmed, his voice unwavering. Iron, because you stood firm under pressure. Wolf, because when the pack scattered, you led. Silent until it mattered. Sharp when it counted. A wolf among sheep. This name will follow you wherever you go. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. She wanted to speak, to explain that she wasn't ready for such a mantle, but her throat was too tight. For so long, she had been invisible, dismissed as ordinary. Now she was being given something far heavier than recognition, a legacy she had to uphold. "Do you understand the weight of this?" the Admiral asked. I think so, sir," she managed. He shook his head slightly. "No, you don't. Not yet. But you will." He stood, walking toward the tall window, gazing out at the waves crashing against the rocky shore. A call sign is not just a name. It is expectation. It is trust. It means others will look to you in chaos and believe you can bring them home. Do not take it lightly. She rose instinctively, her own voice firmer now. "I won't, sir." He turned back to her, and for the first time, she thought she saw something almost like pride flicker in his eyes. "Then stand by," he said. 2 words. Simple, commanding, final. The meeting ended as abruptly as it began. She saluted once more, her chest tight with a storm of emotions, and left the office. The door closed behind her, but the words echoed in her mind like thunder. Iron Wolf, stand by. News spread quickly. By evening, the whispers had turned to shouts. "She has a call sign," cadets muttered in disbelief. The Admiral gave it to her. Some scoffed, furious at the idea that an outsider, nameless and ordinary, had been chosen. Others looked at her with a new kind of respect, though grudging. For her, the name was a double-edged sword. Pride surged when she heard it spoken aloud. But fear followed close behind. Could she live up to it? Could she embody strength when doubt still clawed at her heart? That night, she stood alone on the training field under the pale glow of the moon. The grounds were silent, the air heavy, with salt and the distant roar of waves. She whispered the name into the night, Iron Wolf. The sound of it rolled strangely off her tongue, foreign, yet powerful. It was not who she had been. It was who she would have to become. In the quiet darkness, she made a vow. She would not waste this gift. She would rise to the weight of the name. No matter the storms ahead, she would prove the Admiral right. For the first time, she no longer dreamed of being seen. She had been seen. The dream now was to deserve it. And so, the cadet who had once been invisible took her first step into legend, not as just another face in the crowd, but as the Iron Wolf, standing by for the moment the world would call upon her. The Academy taught cadets that storms could be predicted, disasters rehearsed, and chaos simulated. But the sea, as always, had its own lessons. Her trial came sooner than anyone expected. It was meant to be a routine training exercise, and overnight. Voyage aboard a naval training vessel, a rite of passage for cadets. The ship, modest but seaworthy, carried instructors and 40 cadets eager to prove themselves in real conditions. Spirits were high as they left the harbor, the wind crisp, the ocean vast and shimmering in the afternoon sun. For most, it was the first taste of command outside the Academy walls. For her, it was the first time she wore the name Iron Wolf beyond whispers. The Admiral had not joined them, but she felt his shadow nonetheless, heavy as the horizon. His words haunted her. Do not waste it. Stand by. At first, the voyage unfolded smoothly. Cadets rotated through stations, practicing navigation, engine checks, and communications under watchful eyes. She moved quietly between tasks, carrying herself with focus, but avoiding unnecessary attention. Some cadets still mocked the call, signed behind her back, but others watched her warily, uncertain of what to expect. By evening, the sea began to shift. Dark clouds gathered, rolling low and heavy. The wind sharpened, slicing across the deck. An instructor frowned at the horizon. Storm wasn't in the forecast, he muttered. But the sea doesn't read forecasts. Within an hour, the storm hit. Waves slammed the vessel, tilting it violently. Rain battered the deck, stinging against skin like needles. Lightning, ripped across the sky, followed by thunder so loud it seemed to split the world apart. The cadets, trained in calm waters, staggered and stumbled, their discipline unraveling under the force of reality. "Secure the hatches," instructors barked. "Brace for roll." Another shouted. Panic spread quickly. Some cadets clung to rails, their eyes wide with fear. Others shouted conflicting orders, voices drowned in the roar of the sea. The ship lurched dangerously, its bow plunging into a towering wave before rising again with a groan of strained metal. She felt her body sway, her stomach knotting with fear, but deeper inside, something else stirred. The storm simulation had been a test. This was not. And yet, the chaos felt achingly familiar. An explosion of sparks erupted from below Deck 1. Of the engine panels had shorted. The ship's lights flickered, and for a moment, the deck was plunged into near darkness. Screams pierced the storm. An instructor tried to rally the cadets, but the noise swallowed his words. The crew was losing control. And then, as if the Admiral's voice rose from the thunder itself, she heard it in her memory. "Stand by." Her. Fear snapped like a rope under strain, replaced by the same clarity that had carried her through the simulation. She gripped the rail, steadied herself, and shouted, her voice cutting across the storm. "Power to engines first. We hold the sea. Ship, or we lose everything." The words struck like lightning. A few cadets turned, startled, then obeyed. She pressed forward, water drenching her uniform, her hair plastered to her face. "Navigation, adjust heading. 30 degrees into the wave, don't fight it. Ride it. Secure communications after power stabilizes." She barked orders not as requests, but as commands, her voice sharp with certainty. And this time, unlike the simulation, there was no hesitation. The cadets, desperate for direction, latched onto her voice. 2 cadets bolted below deck with her, fighting against the rolling ship to reach the engine room. Smoke and sparks filled the cramped space. She seized a fire extinguisher, dousing the flames while another cadet reset the circuits. The engines roared weakly back to life. The vibration beneath her boots steadied, and with it, so did her breath. Back on deck, the vessel began to respond. The bow sliced into the waves with more control. The rolling eased slightly, but enough. The instructors, soaked and tense, exchanged glances. They had been shouting themselves hoarse, but it was her voice the cadets were following. They didn't intervene. They didn't stop her. They let her lead. Hours passed like minutes. The storm refused to relent, hammering them with relentless fury. But with every wave, she grew steadier. Her voice carried through the chaos, calm, commanding, alive with a fire she hadn't known until now. At last, as dawn broke, the storm began to weaken. The clouds thinned, the rain softened, and the waves shrank back into uneasy swells. The battered vessel limped forward, scarred but afloat. Exhausted cadets slumped against the rails there, faces pale but alive. She stood at the helm, her hands trembling from adrenaline, her throat raw from shouting. Her body ached, her uniform torn, but her eyes burned with something fierce and unyielding. The instructors approached slowly. One of them, a veteran with years etched into his weathered face, studied her silently before giving a single solemn nod. No medals were pinned that morning, no speeches delivered, but the silence spoke louder than words. Everyone aboard knew what had happened. In the darkest hour of the storm, it had been Iron Wolf who held the line. When the vessel docked at the academy, the cadets stumbled ashore, shaken but alive. Whispers spread like wildfire. "She let us," some admitted grudgingly. "If not for her." They didn't finish the sentence, but the truth was written in their eyes. That night, alone in her bunk, she stared at the ceiling, her body still swaying with phantom waves. She thought of the Admiral. She thought of his challenge. And for the first time, she felt she had answered it, not perfectly, not without fear, but with everything she had. The name Iron Wolf no longer felt foreign. It fit like armor. She whispered into the darkness, her voice hoarse but steady. I stood by. And though the sea would surely test her again, she knew now she would never face it as the invisible cadet she once had been. She was Iron Wolf, and the world had begun to see her. The storm had changed everything. Though no official commendation was given, the cadets knew. Word spread through the academy with the quiet force of truth that when the sea had turned against them, it was Iron Wolf who had stood firm. Some cadets whispered it with admiration, others with jealousy, but none denied it. The name had moved from the Admiral's lips into the Academy's bloodstream, where it pulsed with growing power. But recognition carried weight. With every day, more eyes followed her across the yard, into classrooms, during drills. Expectations pressed against her shoulders. Some cadets sought her guidance, asking quiet questions during training. Others challenged her more fiercely, desperate to prove she was not worthy of the attention she had gained. And through it all, she remained silent, disciplined, aware that every move was now measured not only against herself, but against the call sign she bore. Iron Wolf could not falter. Yet she was still human, and humans needed bonds. Among the cadets, two figures emerged who began to walk more closely beside her. The first was Daniels, a broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed cadet from a family steeped in naval tradition. At first, he had been one of her fiercest critics, scoffing at her name, dismissing her storm leadership as luck. But after witnessing her steadiness firsthand, his disdain softened into something else, respect. He became her sparring partner. During combat drills, pushing her harder than anyone else, testing her limits not out of malice, but to see how far she could truly go. The second was Alvarez, a wiry, quick-thinking cadet with a mischievous grin and a background as ordinary as hers. Alvarez had no legacy, no medals in the family chest, but she carried fire in her heart and a loyalty that never wavered. Where? Daniels challenged her strength. Alvarez steadied her spirit, offering friendship without condition. Together, the three of them formed an unlikely bond tradition, defiance, and resolve bound by shared trials. But bonds were not forged in ease. They were tempered in sacrifice. Their greatest test came not in drills or storms, but in the cold silence of night. It was during a live exercise aboard a larger vessel, part of their advanced training. The cadets were assigned watch shifts, practicing real routines under the guidance of instructors. The sea was calm, the stars sharp against the dark sky. It should have been uneventful, until the fire broke out. A spark in the lower deck ignited an old fuel line, sending flames ripping through the corridor. Alarms blared, red lights flashing. Across the ship, cadets scrambled, instructors barking orders as smoke poured upward. She was among the first to respond, sprinting toward the blaze with Daniels and Alvarez at her side. The heat seared their faces, smoke choking their lungs, as they pulled extinguishers from the wall. "Contain it," Daniels shouted, his voice muffled through the haze. They fought side by side, blasting foam against the flames, working in frantic rhythm. But the fire spread faster than expected, devouring cables, cracking bulkheads. Sparks rained from the ceiling. Through the smoke, she spotted a cadet trapped at the far end of the corridor. He was pinned beneath a fallen beam, flames inching closer. His screams cut through the chaos. "Wolf," Alvarez coughed, her eyes wide with fear. "It's too dangerous." But the decision was already made. She shoved her extinguisher into Alvarez's hands and sprinted forward, the heat slamming against her like a wall. Smoke stung her eyes, every breath a battle, but she forced herself onward. Dropping to her knees, she gripped the beam, muscles straining as she tried to lift. It barely shifted. The cadet beneath cried out, his face pale with terror. "Hold on," she gasped. "I've got you." Daniels appeared beside her, his jaw set with grim determination. Together they heaved, their combined strength groaning against the weight. Slowly, agonizingly, the beam lifted just enough. "Pull him out," Daniels shouted. Alvarez dove forward, grabbing the cadet's arms, dragging him free as the beam crashed back down. The three of them staggered, half carrying the injured cadet, retreating down the corridor as the flames roared behind them. When they finally collapsed into the open air of the deck, gasping for breath, the night sky above them felt like salvation. The instructor swarmed in, taking the wounded cadet, sealing off the blaze. She sat hunched against the railing, lungs burning, her uniform singed, her hands trembling violently. Alvarez dropped beside her, coughing hard but smiling weakly. Daniels leaned against the wall, sweat streaming down his soot-streaked face, his eyes locked on her with something fiercer than respect now. "You're insane," he muttered. Then, after a pause, added, "But you don't break." Iron Wolf. Indeed, the word struck deeper than he knew. For in that moment, she understood the cost of her name. It was not only about leading in storms or commanding in chaos. It was about sacrifice, the willingness to step into fire, to risk herself. For those who could not stand alone. The injured cadet survived. The fire was contained. The exercise continued. But the bond between the three of them, Iron Wolf, Daniels, Alvarez, was forged in that inferno, stronger than steel. Later, in the quiet of the dormitory, Alvarez leaned against her bunk with a grin. "You're going to kill us someday. You know that? Dragging us into storms, fires, whatever else comes." She managed a small smile, though her body still ached. "You could walk away." Alvarez shook her head. "Not a chance. Wolves hunt in packs, don't they?" Daniels, sitting nearby, gave a short nod. "Then this pack stands, together." Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. She had entered the academy invisible, alone. Now, for the first time, she felt the strength of bonds chosen, not inherited. Bonds that demanded sacrifice, yes, but also gave her something to fight for beyond herself. And as she lay awake later that night, staring at the ceiling, she whispered into the silence, "Iron Wolf isn't just me. It's all of us." She understood now what the Admiral had meant. Leadership was not medals or lineage. It was sacrifice for those who followed. And she was ready to bear it, whatever the cost. The academy was never the same after the fire. Though it was recorded only as a training incident, every cadet who had been there knew the truth. Iron Wolf had saved a life, perhaps more than one. The instructors did not announce it. There were no ceremonies, no medals. But respect began to shift in subtle ways. Where once her name had been whispered with doubt, it was now spoken with quiet acknowledgement. Still, she knew the greatest test had not yet come. It arrived with no warning. Months later, during an advanced deployment, the cadets were placed aboard a coastal patrol ship larger and more complex than any training vessel. The mission was intended to simulate multi-day operations, navigation, communications, watch, duty. A handful of seasoned officers commanded the ship, while cadets learned under their eyes. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. The sea was calm, the air thick with salt. Cadets carried out drills, plotted courses, and performed maintenance. Yet she felt an unease in her bones, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. On the third night, the emergency came. A distress call crackled through the radios. A civilian vessel, a small fishing boat, had lost power in heavy seas near the cliffs. The patrol ship was the closest responder. The captain ordered full speed, engines roaring as the vessel surged forward into the dark. Rain began to lash against the deck. Waves rose higher, crashing over the bow. The storm struck with sudden violence, as if summoned from the depths. By the time they reached the coordinates, the fishing boat was barely visible in the spray. Its lights flickered weakly, the hull rocking dangerously close to the jagged rocks. The captain barked orders, officers relaying commands. But the storm grew wilder, the cliffs looming closer. The civilian vessel was minutes from destruction. Panic rippled through the cadets. This was no drill. She stood frozen at first, her hands gripping the rail, the wind whipping her soaked uniform. Memories of the storm simulation, the training vessel, the fire, they all collided inside her. Fear surged, but deeper still came the Admiral's voice, like a beacon through the chaos. "Stand by." She stepped forward. "Sir, we need to angle port 30 degrees and drop rescue lines now," she said, her voice cutting across the storm. The captain hesitated. His eyes flicked to her, a cadet, bold enough to interject. But her voice held the same steel as it had in the storm, the same certainty that had led cadets through fire. He studied her for a heartbeat, and then gave the order. "Port 30, prepare lines." The crew leapt into action. The ship groaned as it turned, riding the waves at a precarious angle. Cadets scrambled to the rail, tossing ropes into the boiling sea. The fishing boat lurched, a wave slamming it broadside. A figure on deck shouted, arms flailing. One line missed, another snapped. Without thinking, she grabbed a harness and clipped herself in. "Wolf!" Daniels shouted, his voice torn by the wind. "Don't you dare!" But she was already over the rail, sliding down the rope, waves clawing at her body. The sea swallowed, her whole icy and merciless. For a moment she was weightless, tumbling, the roar of the storm deafening. Then her hands locked on the line, her body straining as she dragged herself toward the floundering boat. The fishermen's terrified faces came into view. "Grab on," she shouted, voice hoarse but unyielding. She secured the line around one man, then another, signaling for the cadets above to pull. One by one, they were hauled from the doomed vessel, their cries lost in the storm. The last fisherman, an older man, clung desperately to the deck too, weak to climb. The boat tilted dangerously, the rocks looming closer. She didn't hesitate. She dropped onto the deck, slinging his arm over her shoulder, half dragging him toward the rope. The ship groaned, timbers cracking as another wave crashed. "Go!" she shouted upward. The cadets heaved, hauling the man into safety. The fishing boat shuddered, splintering under the weight of the storm. She leapt for the rope just as the vessel broke apart, the sea swallowing it in a violent roar. Her grip slipped once, twice. Then Daniel's hand seized her wrist, pulling with all his strength. Alvarez joined, their combined effort hauling her back over the rail. She collapsed onto the deck, gasping, her body shaking uncontrollably. But the fishermen lived. The ship turned away from the cliffs, battered but intact. The crew cheered, relief pouring over them, like sunlight through storm clouds. She lay there, soaked and trembling, every muscle screaming, but her heart steady. She had stood by. Again, back at the academy, the story could not be contained. Though the official reports listed the rescue as a team effort, every cadet who had been there knew who had gone over the rail. The name Iron Wolf carried no whispers now. It roared through the halls, spoken with respect, awe, and pride. One evening, she was summoned once more to the Admiral's office. He stood at the window as she entered, his back to her, the sea stretching endlessly beyond. You went into the water, he said quietly, his voice heavy as stone. Yes, sir. He turned then, his eyes sharp, his jaw tight. Reckless. She swallowed hard. Necessary. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, a rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You remind me of myself, he admitted. Too stubborn to wait, too fierce to stand idle. But that is why you will go farther than most. You've proven yourself, not just to me, but to them. Her chest tightened. She opened her mouth to answer, but he raised a hand, silencing her. Do not speak. Just remember. He stepped closer, his voice low, solemn. A wolf is never alone. Bonds will keep you alive when iron breaks. Never forget them. She nodded, her throat burning. Now go, he said. Stand by, for the world will call on you again. That night, as she stood on the academy grounds beneath the stars, Daniels and Alvarez flanking her, she finally understood. She had begun as an invisible cadet. She had weathered storms, fire, and doubt. She had been named, tested, and tempered. Iron Wolf was no longer a call sign. It was a legacy. And though her journey had only begun, one truth was unshakable. When the seas grew dark, when chaos reigned, when hope faltered, Iron Wolf would stand by. Always.